You ever get one of those letters that just feels expensive, like before you even open it, you already know it's going to cost you time, money, or sanity? Yeah, mine had the HOA logo stamped on it, bold and self-important, like it paid rent on my mailbox. I remember standing there at the end of my gravel driveway, sun going down, holding this envelope like it might bite me, and thinking, what now? I hadn't painted anything neon. I hadn't built a spaceship in the yard. I hadn't done anything, except mind my business. So I opened it. Big mistake. Your structure is non-compliant. That was the first line. No hello, no courtesy, just straight to the accusation like I'd committed a crime. They listed everything wrong with my barn. The siding, the roof pitch, the faded red paint. They even had the nerve to call it an aesthetic disruption. I actually laughed out loud at that, standing there alone like a crazy person, because that disruption was built by my grandfather with his own hands before half the houses in this neighborhood even existed. This wasn't some DIY weekend project. This thing had history baked into every board, every nail, every crooked line that didn't quite match modern perfection. And somehow, according to a group of people who showed up decades later, it didn't belong anymore. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the barn. Not really. This was about control. See, my place sits at the far edge of the subdivision, kind of where the neat rows of cookie-cutter homes start to lose their grip and things get a little real. My barn didn't match their vision boards or their Pinterest dreams of suburban perfection. It didn't fit the brochure they probably used to sell this neighborhood. And people don't like what they can't control, especially not organizations built entirely around controlling things. A few days later, I got a knock at my door, sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock that says, I'm not here to chat. I opened it, and there she was, Karen. Yeah, not her real name. But if you saw her, you'd agree it fits. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on like she was inspecting a crime scene. She didn't even smile. We've reviewed your property, she said, like she was reading from a script. And the structure in question must be brought into compliance within 30 days. I leaned against the doorframe, took a breath, and asked her the one question I already knew the answer to. You mean the barn? She nodded, slow, satisfied, like she'd been waiting for that moment. It does not meet community standards. Community standards. I almost asked her which community she meant, because last I checked, my grandfather was part of this land long before any committee decided what shade of beige was acceptable. I told her straight up, that barn's been there longer than this HOA. She didn't even blink. That doesn't exempt it, she said, cool and rehearsed, like she'd said it 100 times before. That's when I realized something important. Arguing with her wasn't going to do anything. She wasn't there to understand. She was there to enforce. And people like that, they don't back down just because you have a good point. They double down because they can. So I took the letter, folded it slowly, and said, all right, I'll take a look at my options. She gave me this tight little smile, like she'd already won, turned around, and walked off my porch like she was leaving a battlefield she'd conquered. And I just stood there, watching her go, feeling that mix of frustration and something else. Not fear. Not exactly anger either. More like curiosity. Because here's the thing. They thought this was going to be simple. Send a letter, apply pressure, get compliance. According to their playbook, I was supposed to either fix the barn, tear it down, or fight them in a long, exhausting battle I'd probably lose. That's the psychological play, right? Overwhelm you with rules, make you feel small, make you think resistance isn't worth it. And for a second, yeah, I considered it. Ignoring them, arguing back, hiring a lawyer, all the usual options. But none of those felt right. Because this wasn't just about keeping a building standing. This was about something deeper, about whether something that meant something could be erased just because it didn't look pretty enough for a committee. I walked out to the barn that evening, ran my hand along the wood. Rough, splintered in places, warm from the sun, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, telling me how he built it piece by piece, how he didn't care about perfection, just about making something that lasted. And it had lasted. Longer than him. Longer than the rules trying to tear it down. That's when it clicked. If they wanted to play by the rules, fine. I'd play too. Just not the way they expected. Because somewhere in all those regulations, buried under layers of bureaucracy and paperwork, I knew there had to be something stronger than their aesthetic guidelines. Something they couldn't just override with a vote or a letter. I didn't know exactly what it was yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them win this easily. So instead of drafting a response, instead of calling a lawyer, I did something they probably didn't see coming. I started digging, not into arguments, but into history. And that's where things got interesting. All right, pause the story for a second, because this is where most people mess up, and honestly, it's exactly what HOAs count on. According to standard procedure, when an HOA flags your property as non-compliant, they're not just pointing out a problem, they're initiating a pressure sequence. First comes the notice, then the deadline, then escalating fines, and if you still don't fold, liens, legal action, the whole 9 yards. It's designed to feel overwhelming on purpose, like you're already losing before you even respond. Now, from a legal perspective, here's the part they don't advertise. HOAs only have authority over what their governing documents actually cover, and more importantly, what came after those documents were created. If your structure predates the HOA or falls under separate legal protections, their power starts to crack real fast. But they're betting you won't know that. This is a psychological trap. They rely on perceived authority, not actual authority. Most people see the letterhead, the formal language, the deadlines, and they comply without ever questioning whether the HOA even has jurisdiction in the first place. And look, I get it. It's easier to repaint a barn than to dig through decades of legal records. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fastest way out is actually the slowest move at the start. Because buried in property law, zoning codes, and state regulations, there are protections that override HOA rules entirely. Historic designation is one of them. It doesn't just protect a structure. It changes the entire legal conversation. Suddenly, it's not about, does this match the neighborhood? It's about, are you violating preservation law? And trust me, HOAs don't like fights they can't win. So while they were expecting me to argue, complain, or comply, I was about to do something way more dangerous. I was going to outplay them using the system they thought they controlled. So yeah, while they were busy drafting their next friendly reminder, I was knee-deep in paperwork, dust, and about 50 years of forgotten history. I started with the obvious: county records, property deeds, anything that could prove the barn existed before this whole neighborhood was even a concept. Then I dug deeper. Old permits, tax assessments, even a couple black and white photos my mom had stuffed in a shoebox somewhere, showing my grandfather standing in front of that same barn, younger than I'd ever seen him, proud as hell. And the more I looked, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just some old structure, it qualified. Not emotionally, not sentimentally, but legally. That's when I reached out to the State Historic Preservation Office. Now, if you've never dealt with them before, let me tell you, it's not fast, it's not simple, and they don't care about your feelings. They care about evidence. Dates, materials, architectural integrity, historical relevance. You either have it or you don't. So I gave them everything. Detailed photos of the original beams, the hardware, the construction style, things I'd never paid attention to before suddenly became crucial. I measured angles, documented repairs, explained which parts were original and which were patched over time. It felt less like applying for protection and more like building a case, because that's exactly what it was. Weeks went by. No word from the HOA, which was suspicious. Too quiet. You ever notice how when people think they've got you cornered, they don't rush? They wait. They assume the clock will do the work for them. 30-day deadline, remember? Yeah, they were counting on that. Then day 26 rolled around, and right on cue, another letter showed up. This one had a little more edge to it. Failure to comply may result in fines and further action. Translation: we think you're stalling, and we're about to tighten the leash. I read it, folded it, set it down, and honestly, I smiled. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that the timeline they were using against me, it was about to flip. Day 28, I got the email. Subject line: determination of eligibility. I opened it, heart pounding a little more than I'd like to admit. And there it was, official confirmation that the barn met the criteria for historic designation. Not tentative, not under review, eligible. And once that process crosses that line, everything changes. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew the real moment wasn't that email. It was what came next. Day 30. Deadline day. I woke up early, printed everything. Application, confirmation, supporting documents, and waited. Sure enough, around mid-morning, here comes Karen again. Same walk, same clipboard, Same expression like she's about to close a deal. She didn't even bother with small talk this time. We're here to follow up on your compliance status. Straight to business. I nodded, stepped aside just enough to keep the door between us, and said, perfect timing. Then I handed her the folder. She took it, flipped it open, and for the first time since I'd met her, she paused. Not long. Just enough. Her eyes scanned the header, slowed down on a couple key phrases: state historic preservation, eligible structure, protected status, pending final listing. And you could actually see it, the shift. Subtle but real. Like someone realizing mid-sentence that the conversation just changed languages. What is this? She asked, and her tone wasn't as sharp anymore. Not friendly either, just cautious. I leaned back against the doorframe again, same spot as before, but this time I wasn't the one on defense. It means, I said, keeping it simple, that barn is now under historic consideration, which puts it outside standard HOA modification authority. She didn't respond right away, just kept reading, flipping a page, then another. And here's the thing about people who operate on authority. They're very comfortable when the rules are clear and in their favor. But the moment those rules get complicated, or worse, overridden, they hesitate. Because now it's not about enforcing, it's about risk. We'll need to review this, she finally said, closing the folder a little slower than she opened it. I nodded. Of course you will. She handed it back, adjusted her sunglasses, and for the first time, she didn't have a follow-up command, a deadline, or a threat. Just a retreat. And just like that, she walked away again. But this time, it felt different. Not like she'd won, more like she wasn't sure anymore. A week later, I got the official letter. Not the HOA, the state. Final confirmation. The barn was now a registered historic structure. Fully recognized. Fully protected. And here's where it gets almost funny, because 2 days after that, the HOA sent me another letter. But this one, completely different tone. While we acknowledged the historic designation, that's how it started. Acknowledged. Not challenged. Not denied. Just accepted. We encourage property owners to maintain aesthetic harmony within the community. Encourage. Not require. No deadlines. No penalties. No consequences. Just a polite suggestion wrapped in corporate language. I read that letter twice too, but this time, I wasn't laughing because it was ridiculous. I was laughing because it was over. They'd lost. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And the neighborhood noticed. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, the narrative shifted. That same barn they called an eyesore. People started looking at it differently. Kids would cut across the field and play near it, like it was part of some storybook setting. I caught a couple photographers out there one morning, snapping pictures of the sunlight hitting the old wood like it was something worth preserving, which, apparently, it was. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact started asking questions. How old is it? Who built it? Is it really historic? Funny how quickly perception changes when something gets a label people respect. And me? I didn't change a thing. The paint stayed faded. The roof stayed patched. The wood kept creaking the same way it always had. Because that was the whole point. It wasn't broken. It didn't need fixing. It just needed the right kind of protection. And in the end, that's what made all the difference. Not fighting the system, but understanding it well enough to turn it around. So here's the part nobody really talks about. Because it's not as flashy as the win, and it doesn't fit neatly into a viral clip, but it matters more than anything else in this whole story. The lesson here is, power isn't always about who makes the loudest demands. It's about who actually understands the rules behind those demands. And yeah, HOAs can feel powerful. Letters, fines, legal language, all that polished authority. It's intimidating by design. But most of that power? It's conditional. It only works as long as nobody questions where it stops. And that's where people usually fold. They see the logo, the deadlines, the threats, and they assume compliance is the only path forward. But what this whole situation taught me is something a lot simpler and honestly a little uncomfortable. Most systems don't get challenged not because they're unbeatable, but because they're inconvenient to challenge. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes digging through things you'd rather ignore after a long day. And that's exactly why they work so well. Because people have lives, jobs, stress, and the last thing they want is to fight paperwork with more paperwork. But every now and then, you hit a situation where just going along with it costs more than standing your ground. And when that happens, you've got to shift your mindset. Not emotional, Not reactive. Strategic. Because from a legal perspective, there's almost always a layer beneath the surface. Property rights, grandfather clauses, state protections, historical registries, things that don't show up in a warning letter but carry way more weight when it counts. The trick is knowing where to look, or at least knowing that it's worth looking in the first place. And there's a psychological angle here too, one that's easy to miss if you're caught up in the stress. HOAs, and honestly, a lot of authority structures, rely heavily on momentum. They expect you to move in the direction they push. Fix it, pay it, remove it, just keep things moving forward. What they don't expect is resistance that doesn't look like resistance. No yelling, no arguing, no dramatic standoffs. Just quiet, methodical action that changes the entire playing field. That's what throws them off. Because now they're not dealing with compliance. They're dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty is where control starts to slip. But here's the part one think matters most. And this has nothing to do with law, or HOAs, or even barns. It's about value. Not market value. Not curb appeal. Real value. The kind that doesn't show up in a listing price or a neighborhood guideline. That barn meant something. Not just to me, but to the story of the land. To the people who came before. To the idea that not everything has to be updated, polished, and made uniform to be worth keeping. And yeah, I could have repainted it. I could have replaced it with something newer, cleaner, more acceptable. That would have been easier, faster, probably cheaper in the short term. But it wouldn't have been the same. And that's the trade people make all the time without even realizing it. They trade meaning for convenience, history for approval, character for compliance. So if there's anything to take from this, it's not fight your HOA or register everything as historic. That's not realistic and honestly not always necessary. It's this: when something matters, really matters, take the time to understand what protects it. Not emotionally, legally, structurally, strategically. Because once you know that, you're not just reacting anymore. You're choosing your position. And that changes everything. Now I'm curious, if you were in that situation, what would you have done? Would you have just fixed the barn and moved on? Fought them head on? Or would you have gone digging like I did, looking for a way to flip the script without ever raising your voice? Because trust me, sometimes the strongest move you can make isn't pushing back harder. It's stepping sideways and letting the system collapse under its own assumptions.